Thank you, and great apologies for not being able to come to this morning's session. I had to teach, which I'm hopefully will find you sympathetic toward. And then I had some administrative meetings that had been long scheduled, which I don't expect much sympathy for. But anyway, I'm sure I would have learned much more this morning than I could have imagined. So, and I also have the disadvantage of not having heard the discussion, and so apologies if I'm off kilter, but I hope you'll rein me in and bring me back to where I need to be. So today's discussion, as I understand it, concerns the relationship between civilizations and international order. The relationship of civilizations to the promotion of peace and global order. And China obviously is a worthy topic to be talking about here, not only because of its rich civilizations, and I say civilization plural intentionally, but also because of the readjustment of the international order that has had to occur because of China, what we call China's rise. And the fact that as a major power, China will have a big impact on questions of international peace. So I think we would all agree we can't ignore China. At the same time, as soon as we start thinking about China and Chinese civilization and the question of the impacts of civilization on international peace and order, we run into problems. I suspect some problems of the same nature as you found in talks this morning, and the biggest of this problem biggest of these problems I'm going to start with, and that is to note that actually China has multiple civilizations, multiple traditions of civilization. We tend to focus on one or another, but actually there are a number that are very rich and very important and actually very alive in China today as well. So I want to talk about, just sort of roster a little bit these civilizations and that have something to say about how China should behave in the international arena and have something to say about global order. And then I want to just simply talk a little bit about how the contemporary regime in the People's Republic sort of thinks about issues of global order and peace. And again, we'll find these different traditions feeding in here, and we'll find a fairly complicated picture, one that's easily oversimplified, particularly in American political discourse, but one that is at basis really difficult to kind of get your brains around. Actually, I teach on Chinese foreign policy to both undergraduates and graduates, and the first question, the first sort of comment that I always make is, I'm not going to have a sort of a little package of foreign policy of China to tie up with a neat little bow and hand you. More you will come out of this class all confused with many questions, because there's so many conflicting and diverse streams and strands that are going on in China, and it's very difficult to put it together in a neat package. Okay. So about this problem of which Chinese civilization are we talking about? Well, historians are certainly not shy about discussing the fact that China, as other historical civilizations, actually have competing ideas and traditions, or in some sense competing civilizations. China's no different in this at all. But these competing traditions are not very much a part of the existing consciousness of international relations scholars and international politics scholars. And I want to discuss three main ones. These are Confucianism, legalism, and what some of us call cosmopolitanism. Three traditions of Confucianism, legalism, and cosmopolitanism. I'm going to exclude here another tradition, the Buddhist tradition, which has less to say about international order itself, but certainly some would attach that to this list of three. So the first civilization would be that defined by the idea of Confucianism. And I think when many people think of traditional China, this is what we think of as the idea of the Confucian scholar or the Confucian hierarchy. It's primarily, as you know, a school of thought and really a political as well as social ideology that began with Confucius in the 500s and 400s BC. So obviously very, very long time ago, and was followed on by a very influential scholar, Mencius, in the period around 300 BC, so very much an ancient civilization. Confucianism is a cultural concept. It's not a national concept. It doesn't have a concept of a nation state in it, which is something I'll come back to. And it's a cultural concept that kind of begins with the idea that human beings are born into a society, and we can contrast that very strongly with the idea of kind of the individual in the West, the idea that individuals are born with a set of inalienable rights that must be protected against the state. And Confucianism says, in contrast, that people are first and foremost born into a society and need to recognize their place in that society. And as it sounds like, this is a kind of a domestic communitarian way of thinking. It's based around proper behavior and proper treatment of those both above you and below you in the hierarchy. The ideal Confucian society is one of a moral order, right? A moral social order. The most desired outcome of the social order is harmony. So, for example, the Chinese emperor were to keep harmony between heaven and earth. This was the position of the emperor. It was the not the privilege of the emperor, but the duty or the responsibility of the emperor. And this creation of harmony was made primarily by being beneficent, right, and behaving properly. So engaging in proper ritual. So we might think of sweeping of the ancestors' graves and that kind of thing, but also behaving properly toward all those around, and certainly not engaging in corruption. You know, the emperor's reign was often, as it is written in official historical documents written by the states, the emperor's reign would come to an end if they did not uphold this social order, primarily by behaving properly. So the good state, the good government, is one that maintains harmony between heaven and earth, and harmony on earth, prosperity, and so forth. So what does this mean for foreign policy? Well, and international order. Confucianism does have important implications about international order. Primary among these is the idea that foreign policy should seek influence through benevolence and persuasion, rather than through domination and coercion. In the imperial era, the Chinese capital, the emperor in the capital of Beijing or Nanjing or Xi'an or wherever the capital was for that particular emperor, was primarily concerned with the neighborhood, the Asian neighborhood, not really looking abroad to the West or to Africa or Latin America and so forth. They were primarily concerned with the Asian neighborhood. And they believed that simply by being Confucian, I say according to Confucian theory, they believed that by behaving properly, other societies, Vietnam, Japan, South Korea, would see this beautiful civilization and want to be like them. This is sort of the essence of soft power. You know, you would attract countries around you by behaving properly and with beneficence. And force, although not unheard of in this Confucian ethic, would be used only as a last resort for defensive purposes or to advance righteous goals in punitive wars. Now, this doesn't mean that China did not fight wars. It did, and sometimes these wars were designed to take territory, to primarily take territory in the periphery in order to defend the heartland. We might even say the Han Chinese heartland. Nevertheless, the history of Confucianism and foreign relations has largely been written to say that China does not need force, and that China never has been an expansionist power. So beneficence, rule, persuasion is a primary foreign policy tool, with force really very secondary. Another couple of aspects of Confucianism as they relate to foreign relations, I'll just flag here because so many people think of them. One is that Confucianism is not, how would we put it? It's not a system of moral relativism. It's not a system that says, you behave how you want and we'll behave how we want. There really was a sense that this is the superior way to behave according to Confucian tenets. And this has, in the Asian region, led to the idea that the Chinese emperors thought of themselves as the center of the universe, not only the center of the universe between heaven and earth, but also the center of the earthly universe. If you ascribe to our civilizational ideals, then you're civilized. If you don't ascribe to them, then you're barbarian. So we often hear this idea of the Chinese treatment of other civilizations as barbaric, and there is that element in Confucianism. Also, the Confucian ethic, because it believed in its own self-sufficiency, meant that it needed little contact with others. There was a sense that we didn't need from abroad, we didn't need goods from abroad, we didn't need ideas from abroad, because we are a self-sufficient ethic. We're happy to send out what we know about civilization, but we don't need to take from others. And this is the often commented on idea of China as inward-looking during the imperial era. Now, some prominent scholars, particularly John King Fairbank, sort of the dean of China historians in this country anyway, wrote quite extensively about how under this cover of Confucianism, we did see actually extensive trade, extensive what we would call tributary trade, where gifts could be brought to the Chinese border, and as long as those bearing the gifts kowtowed or kowtowed, which literally is knocking your head 3 times on the floor to the diplomat that was sent to the border, or the trader, the comprador sent to the border to receive the goods, then it was okay, they could come in. But there was a sense, no, we don't need much. So Confucianism, as I'll say a little bit later, we think of often as the dominant civilization of traditional China, traditional meaning imperial China or pre-1911 China. And yet it competed both in terms of, well, when I say the dominant civilization, I think really what I mean is that subsequent dynasties and the historians who were always historians of the state. China did not historically have this tradition of independent scholars, always scholar officials, wrote an official history to kind of say, and this is how we, China, followed Confucian precepts as we went about our foreign relations. And so this self-narrative from China has generally been fairly well accepted as the core civilization that we might think about today. And yet it competes strongly with a second strand, which I'm calling legalism. If you're an IR student or scholar, it will sound to you very close to realism. It is very close to realism, actually. So one of the very hotly contested areas of Chinese sort of foreign policy history is whether China, across the ages, has had a warlike DNA, has had a DNA propensity for war. And certainly there are books on both sides, and it's quite hotly debated. China does have historical tradition, legalism, that emerged in the period following the Warring States era. So the Warring States era lasted, sort of after the life of Confucius, during the life of Mencius. It's from about 400 to about 220 BC. And the Warring States was a time when China was divided into local fiefdoms that fought each other. They fought in order to take territory in this anarchical war of all against all, with the goal of each fiefdom to achieve greater and greater territory and power from their neighbors, right? And the period of the Warring States didn't resolve itself. Not one particular local fiefdom took over the rest. Rather, the outcome was the unification of China by the most famous and tyrannical emperor, the Emperor Qin, or Qin Shi Huangdi. And I don't know if any of you have ever been to Western China, to the city of Xi'an, where you see the terracotta warriors in the grave around the emperor. This is the Emperor Qin. And Emperor Qin is very much revered also in Chinese history. Why? Well, because he drawing on this strand of legalism, which says that the good state is a strong state militarily. Its state is a strong state that can keep these, rascally individuals in line, because human beings are basically not good. Right? They're self-interested and so forth. If they are not properly controlled, they will not contribute to the general good. So legalism says a good state is a strong state. Confucianism says a good state is a moral state, a good Confucian ethic state. And this also meant that in terms of, so Qin Shi Huangdi unified by using force. And he is very much revered for having unified China out of a divided situation. But in terms of foreign policy, the link here is that legalism provides a heritage for an understanding that the global order isn't one that Confucianism would have it, which is that if we behave properly, others will see our innate goodness and want to be like us. Rather, the global order is Hebesian. It's a war of all against all, that you must look and fight against your primary enemy and try to defeat them, because if you don't defeat them, they will defeat you. And it's an order in which, to use contemporary terms, cooperation is highly unlikely. You might cooperate for a short period of time, have a kind of short-term marriage of convenience, if you will, but where long-term alliances are simply not to be expected. So in the legalist tradition was not often written about, actually, in the grand histories of the dynasties, right? That history was written about China as being Confucian. And yet, through the works of Sun Tzu and the glorification of the Emperor Qin, and actually in IR scholarship today, we see very, very strong tendency toward legalist or realist precepts, right? And as I will say in a minute or two, many people think that Mao Zedong himself was the ultimate realist in terms of the way he thought about foreign policy in the world. The third sort of big tradition, also not really talked about in official history, but very compelling, and we see this tradition spelled out most clearly in the time of the Tang Dynasty, T-A-N-G, the Tang Dynasty, from the 7th to the 10th centuries A.D. This is a time when Chinese culture is seen to have been at its creative best, a time when in the modern day city of Xi'an, which then Chang'an was the capital, was seen to be the greatest city in the world, a very liberal and cosmopolitan place with great wealth and a very, very sophisticated cultural life. It was also a time of great peace and prosperity for China domestically when the emperors could encourage people to kind of push the boundaries of art and literature and so forth. So departing from Confucianism's tendency toward an inward focus, and this is the point that's most important for us, this era also exhibited great comfort with an open and outward focus. Vast riches poured into China from trade with people beyond its western borders primarily, and the signature foreign policy project was the Silk Road, right, which encouraged vast trade between China and Europe, particularly through Central Asia and Eastern Europe. And it also supported a very robust diplomacy backed by a very sophisticated bureaucracy. So we use the term cosmopolitanism to sort of suggest a sort of liberal openness to the outside world and an assumption that peace and cooperation could dominate. And this is a tradition also of which Chinese today are extremely proud. And maybe you've heard of the big initiative of the Xi Jinping regime that was announced a couple of years ago, the New Silk Road, we call it, or the One Belt, One Road initiative. And this is kind of harkens to this idea of a time of great openness of China to trade and all sorts of exchange. Okay, so here we have three grand intellectual and behavioral traditions, three civilizational traditions, if you will, that come from the imperial era, and as I'll say in a bit, each have their influence today. We tend to see them as distinct entities, but their strands exist side by side, making it difficult to understand what Chinese civilization has to offer as kind of a neat package. I want to just mention something that I have always found a very, very interesting puzzle, very interesting, and something I always put to my students. After 1911, when the imperial era ended, fell, China went through first a long Republican era. We call it the Republican era from 1911 to 1949. China was a republic, or it had the institutions of a republic, meaning a representative government. And during this time, in part as a reaction to the experience of China with the West, with the imperialist West, the carving up of China like a melon during what they call the Century of Humiliation, from the first Opium Wars in 1839 until Mao took over in 1949. There was a very, very important new political culture, and that was nationalism. I emphasized when I talked about Confucianism how Confucianism is seen as a culture, sees China as a culture. What is important about China is the culture. The Republican era, and in particular the May 4th movement of the Republican era, I'm just saying these historical names in case they ring a bell to anybody, but in particular the May 4th movement began to think of China as a nation state, and in a way that had not been thought of before. China came very, very late to the idea that it was a nation state and that it could embrace something of a nationalist ideology. So the Republican era saw the growth of a very substantial military, helped by foreign powers. But for our purposes, most striking was the self-conscious attempt to overhaul Chinese culture, to say that Confucianism was backward, it is Confucianism, and the imperial mode that held China back from modernity. So also in this time, Chinese leaders take on a kind of Stalinist vision of modernity. It's really quite striking. We think of, okay, Mao, Stalin, but really this idea of the modern state as defined by Stalin became very appealing. And they began to think of China and the global order more in terms of internationally authenticated isms, we might say, of constitutionalism at first, communism later on, right? So they began to import these categories of self-definition. And I think this is so interesting because, again, I wish I had been able to hear the discussion this morning, but when I think of civilizations, I tend to think of kind of humming along over time. And yet with China, again, all I know is China, you see absolutely dramatic attempts to throw out the old civilization. It is seen to have failed, and yet today we see it kind of come back, right? We see an attempt to replace it with nationalism and the kind of the fetishism of the nation state, if you will, in a very, very deliberate political order. And we see this in the Republican era, and we see this, of course, in the communist era with Mao Zedong. I'll also mention that it was this Republican government, the Republican era government, that inherited a vast, from the previous dynasty, the Qing dynasty, that's Qing, the Qing dynasty, inherited a vast empire. This expanse that was multicultural and included not only kind of the Han heartland, but also Manchuria, Mongolia, East Turkestan, Tibet, and other areas. And no Chinese empire had ever been so big for so long. And it was the Republican era, and then subsequently, it was the Republican government, and then subsequently the communist government that has sort of taken that as their sacred borders. While the Qing obtained these borders and claimed them for China, the Qing Empire eventually fell apart, but the replacement empires or the replacement governments kept them as their borders. So political nationalism that came out of this Republican era sort of set forth, we could say, or established for China this geographic realm as the core part of the nation that needed to be defended. And then I'll also just mention very briefly Maoism. Little needs to be said about Maoism, except that Mao too thought it was extremely important to overthrow what he called feudal civilizational influences, largely Confucianism. Mao had many campaigns, political campaigns, to oppose Confucianism and to oppose feudal, sometimes he called them bourgeois, but feudal tendencies that came out of the old China. And of course, the desire was to create a new socialist man, primarily. Mao was also highly nationalist in his foreign policy. He was not internationalist, as we might expect from a good Marxist. And some would see Mao as the creator and exporter of a very important foreign policy tool, that's guerrilla warfare, which he used to great success to fight and win against the nationalist government. But in political science, as I said before, we often see him as the ultimate realist, as a strategic realist, both when deciding to ally with his enemies to fight the Japanese, to ally with the United States, not ally, to lean toward the United States, to counter the Soviet Union, and so forth. So here, I would call this more a patchwork of civilizational influences. Confucianism, legalism, cosmopolitanism, nationalism, and then we can toss Maoism in there. And I think we can almost see this concept of Chinese civilization as like a Rorschach test. I don't know if everybody here is familiar with the concept of a Rorschach test, these ink blot posters that at some era in psychiatry were supposed to be used, doctor would hold it up to show the patient, what do you see in this ink blot? And everybody would have a different thing that they saw. But the point is that you see what you want to see in it, right? You see your own interpretation of it. And sometimes we can think of understandings of Chinese civilizational influences on foreign policy in that way. We can find an awful lot of different and what seem to us to be, in the West anyway, to be conflicting strands. Okay, so all of these remain. And I'm just going to, again, kind of run through the ways in which we see these grand traditions coming to the fore today. Cosmopolitanism. I think, one of the things, I study international political economy of China, and one thing I think is not often that well appreciated is how much China opened up to global influences in its reform and opening period, the Deng Xiaoping period. I mean, the degree of openness of the economy in particular, and in many sort of aspects of culture is truly astounding. In the United States, we tend to focus on, they're not trading fair, and they're not, but the fact is that China went from having virtually no influence on the global agenda or the global economy to now, if their stock market falls, we're all like running to look at our 401ks to wonder what's happening and why can't their leaders better manage their economy, right? So the change has been absolutely phenomenal and unresented in China, right? So if we think of China as being sort of closed inward and all this kind of stuff, it underestimates the degree to which the effort to reach out to the world and make sure that China was integrated into the world occurred. I always remember when I first started going to China in the early 1980s, something I'm a little bit ashamed of, is that young kids often would kind of pop out from like behind a tree or in a park and say, hello, hello, and then pop back in and giggle, and I was, I think they're learning English, right? Never thinking, right? Never sort of considering the broader picture here. But if you say now 30 years later, the idea of a national program to make English the legitimate second language, not seeing it as the American language, but seeing it as the global language, of international trade and now diplomacy, and we have to do it, so let's go ahead and do it, and all the amount of energy, hours, sweat that have relatively successfully been put into this acculturation without resentment, until a tiny bit now, without resentment, I think is often forgotten. So this cosmopolitan tradition I see is very, very strong and certainly very, has had a lot of influence. Not the only influence, but a lot of influence. The second, from legalism, the desire, the urge to develop a comprehensive national power, the idea that the good Chinese state is a strong Chinese state, very, very much there in political statements. The idea that power in the world is zero-sum, that we cannot trust cooperation very much, right? That our first job is to defend against any who would challenge our core interests. That's not a horrible thing, that's what nation states do, you might say, but this very strong language that this is our sacred duty. This is very much tied up with a nationalist agenda as well. This is also there. This is also there very, very strongly. This has been almost the only legitimate way of thinking in IR scholarship in China as well, as it's grown over the years. After they sort of decided they didn't want to analyze the world in terms of Marxism-Leninism anymore, they kind of went straight to realism. This is partly the influence of Western American scholars in particular, but it's become very, very deep in scholarship, I think, because it resonates with some of the views among elite foreign policy makers as well. And in terms of this third grand tradition, and most confusing to me, is the reemergence of Confucianism. Okay, after all these years of trying to get rid of the influence of Confucianism, we now see as a very important state project the search for what what are our true civilizational roots? And how can we offer them to the world? And so there's been this effort, because all universities are tied to the government, to the state, there's been a strong effort to plant the seeds among particularly IR scholars of how they should begin to see Confucian and talk about the global order and reform of the global order along Confucian lines. This has gone along with a political line that's, by the way, line, it sounds so pejorative. In Chinese, it's not pejorative at all. This is the way they talk about it. So it's, but I'm sorry that it sounds like I'm just saying it's just a line. But they say we have a line, and this is our line. And our line is that China will never be expansionist. China was never a hegemony. China will never behave as a hegemonic power the way some others will. Right? We know who they mean, even though they don't often always, anyway, label the United States. Rather, we want to show the world the greatness and the benevolence of the traditional Chinese civilization. Oh, by the way, the civilization that we spent many years trying to get rid of, and we'll do this in part through using the big kind of unspoken foreign policy tool of Confucianism, and that is soft power. So, for example, on our campus here, we have the Confucius Institute all over the world, the first one in the United States, maybe the second one in the world. We will, have our China Daily insert in the Washington Post, and we want to really show. We will support students to come and study in China, just as they are studying overseas and so forth. So I would say this is almost the least deep of these trends today. It does feel, according to colleagues of mine in China, it feels more imposed from the state. They don't find much oomph to it, and they don't quite know what a global order managed by benevolence and proper behavior would look like. And this may be, I think this is mainly because, it's mainly because of something I will say in a minute, which is that they also see themselves as integrating into an established international order. So how do you bring these behaviors into the established order? Okay. So finally, where does this leave us in terms of the current regime, the current, I would call, Xi Jinping regime, Xi Jinping being the head of the party and Xi Jinping being the president of the government, of this kind of two parallel organization party state. Xi Jinping is a very interesting guy because he has stated much more strongly and starkly many things, nothing especially new, but he is very clearly trying to articulate more clearly China's place in an international order and some thoughts about how this international order might be reformed. So I think it is, I'm often of the mind to say a particular leader doesn't make a difference. It doesn't make sense to pay attention to anyone. But there's something different about Xi Jinping, and I think most Chinese would tell you that as well. So Xi Jinping, China exhibits in terms of ideas about the international order, a few things about the regional order, which is extremely important to China, the Asian regional order, a few things, and then some things about Neo-Confucianism and how that might be influential, how China's contribution might be through Neo-Confucianism. So in terms of the international order, the current political line, as expressed by the head of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the People's Congress, which is pretty authoritative, is that China's joining the international order. They why do you always ask us, why do you always suggest that we want to overturn the international order? We don't want to overturn the international order. We have committed to joining the international order. And we accept that order, although we want to reform it. We know that it was developed outside of China's own traditions, without a lot of active contribution by communist China, by post-49 China, yet we accept it. And what is this order that they accept? It is a conservative, sovereign state-led, UN-based, and UN-led order. So here there is a strong attempt to distinguish between the United Nations and the United States. And something that's very interesting to me is not so much about it being the UN. I mean, if we think of the UN as being sovereign states, sort of a conservative sovereign state-led order, China's very comfortable with that. But I think it's also relevant because China is not saying we China want to lead. We China want to be a leader of this order. Rather, we want to contribute to the leading of the order by an international organization that is the United Nations. And in particular, in very recent months, we want to emphasize China's contribution to that order, particularly through our provision of global public goods and infrastructure spending in particular. So again, maybe you've heard about the Asian AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Thank you. Slight brain freeze there. AIIB and the One Belt, One Road, or the New Silk Road project, and to some degree the New Development Bank. So they say, look, this is our contribution to to the existing global order by providing additional public goods. This, the hotness of this term, global public goods, is very interesting to see. It's really only been among scholars in China in the last couple of years. So we want to contribute. And our contribution is not zero-sum. They often will say, we hear much about the potential that the AIIB might compete with the World Bank, and especially might compete with the Asian Development Bank. And there's no. We reassure you that this is not a zero-sum contribution. The world needs this, and we will donate to it. But we also wish to reform this order. We wish to create a more equitable global order with more room in it for the developed world. We oppose power-based alliances. So again, here they oppose sort of what they see as a core of a U.S.-led order, which is the U.S.-led NATO alliance. We oppose power-based alliances that compete with this UN order. They don't see them as working together. They see them as competing orders. Of course, China has a strong seat in the UN-led order. China has no seat in a NATO alliance order. And it is perhaps a sort of telling phraseology when Xi Jinping proposed to build what he called a new model of major country relations. Sometimes we say a new model of great power relations. The translation can vary. New model of major country relations based on 4 precepts: no conflict, no confrontation, mutual respect, and win-win cooperation. So this is sort of the official line that is coming out about what the international order should look like, and China is a contributor to it, both in terms of having a seat at the table and in terms of global public goods provision, which is something China can do because of its foreign currency reserves. At the same time, these visions of an international order compete with a different and more challenging, or less reformist, more radicalized, perhaps, view of what of the U.S. role in the region, in the Asian region. So we hear, based on this idea that it's China's time to regain its rightful place as an equal nation in the world. We hear that the first place that China needs to have an equal place is in its region, in its backyard. And so we see this kind of push-pull of both soft power efforts to attract Asian, Southeast Asian, South Asian, East Asian nations to China, and at the same time to take a more pointed and defensive stance toward any who would challenge these interests, primarily the United States, but also some countries within the Asian region as well. This is an arena where this nationalist tradition that I talked about, in the rhetoric comes through very, very clearly. So again, I'm suggesting there are a couple of different levels of rhetoric. Okay, there are, in different realms, Chinese official lines sound quite different. So the global order, international order, we have, yes, cooperation, win-win, UN-based. In the region, it's much more of this nationalist tradition, like, get out of my backyard. This is where I belong. You took it away before, and now it's time to give it back to me. Right? And then we also see, as I mentioned, a stream of what we might call neo-Confucian thinking. I think I mainly covered what I wanted to here, but it emphasizes notions of restrained and beneficent leadership. So one of the terms that is used here is it's 天下, it's all under heaven. So all of us together and unified under heaven. This vision as an alternative view that is seen as much more inclusive than the state-led Westphalian system that China also adheres carefully to. This 天下 vision is one that seeks to incorporate differences of others rather than to conquer others. As I mentioned before, this is a vision that both is sponsored by the government primarily. Scholars have kind of taken up the call for it. I don't think it's gone very far in defining sort of instruments and, sort of exactly how this would work, and in particular in clarifying its role alongside this sort of more reformed global order or this more antagonistic regional order. So how these fit together in a coherent policy, not that we should necessarily expect them to fit together in a coherent policy. I think that would be false to say that they must, but exactly how they might work together has not been quite defined by the Chinese government. So let me stop there. I've talked too long, and I'd be happy to engage in any discussion or debate or answer any questions that you may have.